Hey, this is Dave DeCamp from antiwar.com. This is anti-war news for Tuesday, February 25th, 2025. All right, so first thing I want to go over today, help defend the guard advance in Montana. This is actually in the lower part of our top news section, but I think it's important and I want to kind of get this out there. So state legislators in Montana are coming under enormous pressure from two-star generals who are lobbying against the Defend the Guard Act. And if you're not familiar with Defend the Guard, this is state-level legislation that would prohibit the federal government from deploying a state's National Guard to an area where Congress has not declared war. And Congress hasn't declared war since World War II. This would significantly impact the executive branch's ability to wage unconstitutional wars, because the National Guard gets deployed to all these hotspots in the Middle East, in Syria, in Iraq, also in Somalia. So this is very important legislation. It has yet to become law in a state, but it's really making some progress this year. And I think the fact that they send the generals to try to kill these bills really goes to show that it is a threat to the war machine, to the war state, to the, whatever you want to call it. So a committee in the Montana House of Representatives is set to vote to advance Defend the Guard on Wednesday. Generals have arrived in the state to take Democrats who support the legislation up for a helicopter ride, where they will likely threaten federal funding if the bill is advanced. So this is what they do. They go in and they threaten these state representatives with funding cuts. And this really derails all of the work that the grassroots activists do. The guys that Bring Our Troops Home, which is the organization behind Defend the Guard, they do a lot of work, really painstaking work, to get these state representatives to support this legislation. And then the generals come in and make these threats and totally upends the whole thing. And they use these pressure tactics across the country. In one case in Kansas, a general threatened state lawmakers that their state would be nuked if they passed this legislation. And this is just completely outrageous, these threats that these generals make. So what does it take to counteract that? It takes a lot of people making phone calls, because if these state representatives don't have, anybody really pushing them on the other side, they're just going to listen to the generals and say, okay. And, you figure a lot of these people are, have their eyes on higher office potentially. So if they don't hear from people, then they're not going to vote for this to advance this legislation. So in this story, there is this very helpful graphic that the guys that Bring Our Troops Home made, and it shows the 5 Democratic legislators in Montana who we need to call and tell them to support the bill. So do this on Tuesday if you can. If you live in Montana especially, definitely do it. If you're outside the state in the U.S., you can call and say that you are a supporter of this movement and that you hope to advance Defend the Guard in your home state, and say something like, it'd be great to see Montana do this first. Be positive, be nice to them, and tell them that you support it. So I'll put the link to this story in the description so you can go look at this graphic and make these calls. I say it all the time. I think the best kind of anti-war activism that Americans can do at the moment is trying to push through Defend the Guard. It's decentralization. It's a way to really take a war-making power away from the federal government. And again, it just goes to show these guys are literally fighting against the generals on this. And there's been, so while you have the generals, they're able to go around and lobby against this stuff. If you're in the National Guard and you speak out about it, you could be punished. So because of that, there's been anonymous members of the National Guard writing open letters, and the Libertarian Institute published one saying why they support this legislation. So again, I think it's really important, and I'll put the link in if you want to make the calls. Again, just be nice and say, hey, we really support this. We want to see Montana be, the first state to make this law. Let's do it. And again, if you live in Montana, let me know if you live in Montana, or let me know if you make the call in general. It's good to encourage people. I know, it feels weird sometimes making these phone calls, but a lot of people are doing this, and you could always volunteer to phone bank with Defend the Guard to do more activism like this. So please, if you can, go make some calls on Tuesday, and hopefully this thing doesn't get killed by these generals. All right, so the first story to get into the other news here, the first story at the top of antiwar.com, Gaza ceasefire deal is on the brink of collapse. So the Gaza hostage and ceasefire deal is on the brink of collapse due to Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu hardening his stance. And this is according to an Israeli source speaking to the Israeli news site Walla. So Netanyahu has delayed the release of over 600 Palestinians who were supposed to be freed from Israeli jails in exchange for 6 Israeli hostages released by Hamas on Saturday. Netanyahu said that he postponed the release over Hamas's humiliating handover ceremonies. Under the agreement, Hamas is due to release 4 bodies of Israeli hostages on Thursday, which is the last release under the first phase of the ceasefire deal. So the Israeli source speaking to Walla said that Hamas had agreed that apparently in negotiations, they've agreed that they would release these 4 bodies, or that they could release these 4 bodies in private without a ceremony. But Netanyahu has hardened his stance further, informing mediators that Hamas's commitment was not enough and that Israel would only release these Palestinians once they get the bodies. And the Israeli official said, quote, "Unfortunately, there are people in the government who are more interested in Hamas's ceremonies than they are in returning civilians for burial in Israel," end quote. So the first phase of the ceasefire will expire this Saturday, March 1st. And so far, there's no deal on a second phase. The U.S. is now saying, and the U.S. has backed Netanyahu's decision to not release these Palestinians, even though it's a blatant violation of the deal. The U.S. is now saying, oh, we could extend phase 1. I mean, and the implication there is that in phase 2 is when Israel is supposed to fully withdraw from Gaza and the permanent ceasefire is supposed to begin. The implication is, if they're just extending phase 1, is that Israel's not going to withdraw and it's not going to be a permanent ceasefire. So that's not a good sign. And, you know, we've seen Netanyahu recently repeatedly vow to restart the genocidal war on Gaza. So again, with this deal, things are just very shaky. Israel continues to, we saw some Israeli airstrikes, it looked like, in Gaza on Monday, and Israel's killed over 100 Palestinians in Gaza since January 19th, the day that the ceasefire went into effect. So things are still very shaky. The next one here, Deputy Knesset Speaker says all adult men in Gaza should be killed. So Nissim Vaturi, the Deputy Speaker of the Israeli Knesset, has called for all adult men in Gaza to be killed in the latest example of genocidal rhetoric from an Israeli official. So Vaturi said this in a radio interview. He said, quote, "Who is innocent in Gaza? Civilians went out and slaughtered people in cold blood. We need to separate the children and women and kill the adults in Gaza. We are being too considerate," end quote. So Vaturi, who is a member of Netanyahu's Likud party, referred to the Palestinians in Gaza as subhumans and scoundrels. So this time he's talking about all Palestinians in Gaza, saying that they're subhuman. I mean, when we talk about genocidal rhetoric, I mean, that's exactly what this is. He said that nobody in the world wants to take in the Palestinians from Gaza. He said, quote, "The international community understands that the residents of Gaza are not welcome anywhere and is pushing them towards Israel," end quote, which is just such an absurd way to frame the whole situation, considering the Palestinians in Gaza, at least most of them are refugees or descendants of refugees who were pushed out of their homes by the Zionists. The deputy speaker also said that the city of Jenin in the occupied West Bank will soon be turned into Gaza as Israel is ramping up its assault there. He said that Palestinians being freed from Israeli jails as part of the Gaza hostage and ceasefire deal should be put in Jenin so they could be eliminated later on. Basically saying, oh, you know, those Palestinians we're freeing, stick them in Jenin, we'll take care of them later. He said, quote, "Erase Jenin. Don't start looking for the terrorists. If there's a terrorist in the house, take him down, tell the women and children to get out," end quote. So last year, Vaturi claimed that there were no innocents in Gaza and called for the entire place to be burned down so Israeli soldiers would not get hurt. This is last year. He said, quote, What does it mean to burn, to go in and rip them apart? There should be no thoughts, no considerations. The soldiers of the IDF should not think for 1 second and be hurt because we need to be humane, end quote. So this is the kind of guy that we're dealing with here, and we've seen this rhetoric from Israeli officials, and a lot of this has been cited in South Africa's genocide case against Israel at the ICJ. All right, so the next one here, Israel replicates Gaza land corridor in occupied West Bank. This article's from The Cradle. Israel is looking to construct roads in the occupied West Bank, replicating the infamous Netzarim corridor in Gaza, Hebrew media reported on February 24th. According to Israel's Channel 13, the Israeli army and security agencies are working to create roads similar to the Netzarim corridor, though narrower, in Jenin and Tulkarem. The roads aim to prevent militants from planting explosives and provide a quick route for forces. So the Netzarim corridor, which Israeli forces withdrew from during the fragile Gaza ceasefire, was constructed to split the Gaza Strip into two parts and prevent the return of the displaced to the north. And brutal war crimes were carried out by Israeli forces at Netzarim, including the execution of unarmed civilians. They had a policy: if anybody's approaching us, we open fire, shoot, and kill them, even if they're unarmed civilians. And we saw reporting from Israeli media that they counted these, when they would kill unarmed civilians, they counted them as terrorists. So the Channel 14 report comes as Israel intensifies a massive military operation against several West Bank cities, which began last month, and Israeli tanks have entered the Jenin refugee camp in the occupied West Bank on Sunday for the first time since the Second Intifada in 2002. So major escalations in the West Bank. Then you have Israel Katz saying that Israel has forcibly displaced 40,000 Palestinians and that they cannot return home, and that the Israeli military is going to be there for the coming year. So really not looking good for the situation in the West Bank. Ethnic cleansing, annexation is on the mind. That's what Israel wants to do here. And it's something that the Trump administration appears to be ready to back. All right, so the next one here, the U.S. votes against the UN condemning Russia for the war in Ukraine. So this was really something. On Monday, the U.S. and Russia were among 18 nations that voted against a Ukrainian drafted resolution at the UN General Assembly that condemned Moscow and called for a Russian withdrawal from Ukraine on the third anniversary of the Russian invasion. The resolution passed in a vote of 93 to 18, with 65 countries abstaining from voting. The U.S. had been pressuring Ukraine to withdraw the resolution as the Trump administration is seeking better relations with Russia and an end to the proxy war. The U.S. actually introduced its own resolution that simply called for peace in Ukraine, but European countries were able to add an amendment that inserted anti-Russian language. After that amendment was added, the U.S. abstained from voting. They didn't vote against their own resolution, but they abstained after that amendment was added, and it passed in a vote of 93 to 8. So just the difference, the contrast between the Biden administration at the UN and now this Trump administration, how they're handling Ukraine and Russia, just completely different. And in remarks to the UN, U.S. Ambassador Dorothy Shea referred to Russia's invasion of Ukraine as an escalation of the Russia-Ukraine war and said that the conflict started 11 years ago, referring to the war that broke out in Ukraine following the U.S.-backed coup in 2014 that ousted former President Viktor Yanukovych. Again, this is just a huge shift from the last administration that was constantly calling it an unprovoked invasion, now basically saying, well, this is an escalation of a war that was happening in Ukraine already. So, I mean, I think this really does go to show that they are serious about wanting to end the war. Things like this. And Shea said that many UN resolutions that have demanded a Russian withdrawal from Ukraine have failed to end the conflict. She said, quote, "Since the start of the war 11 years ago, the United Nations has repeatedly condemned Russia's blatant violations of the UN Charter. Multiple resolutions of the General Assembly have demanded that Russia withdraw its forces from Ukraine. Those resolutions have failed to stop the war. It has now dragged on for far too long and at far too terrible a cost to the people in Ukraine, in Russia, and beyond," end quote. And she called for an end to the war. So, still critical of Russia there, saying that they blatantly violated the UN Charter back in 2014, referring to Russia taking Crimea. But still just a striking shift in the language from the U.S. when it comes to this conflict. All right, so the next one here, Ukrainian amputee soldiers continue to fight. This article is from Kyle Anzalone at the Libertarian Institute. This is really something here. So the Associated Press interviewed several Ukrainian soldiers who suffered horrific injuries, leaving them with permanent disabilities, but they returned to the battlefield. So actual amputees returning to fight. According to the outlet, many Ukrainian brigades have at least one, often several, amputee soldiers still on active duty. One such soldier, Andriy Rubluik, lost both his arms in a mine explosion in 2022. And we could look at this Associated Press report here and see the pictures of these guys that have gone back to the front line with, missing limbs, missing hands, holding their weapons, missing legs, operating drones, missing an arm here. It just really goes to show how depleted the Ukrainian forces are if they're sending these guys actually back into the battlefield. All right, so the next one here, Trump says he's in talks with Putin on a major U.S.-Russia economic deal. So President Trump said on Monday that he was in serious discussions with Russian President Vladimir Putin about ending the war in Ukraine and the possibility of economic deals between the U.S. and Russia. Trump wrote on Truth Social, quote, "I am in serious discussions with President Vladimir Putin of Russia concerning the ending of the war and also major economic development transactions which will take place between the United States and Russia. Talks are proceeding very well," end quote. So while the U.S. has not committed to lifting economic sanctions on Russia, Secretary of State Marco Rubio has made clear that sanctions relief will likely be part of a deal to end the war in Ukraine, and that could pave the way for future U.S.-Russia economic cooperation. Trump also said in his Truth Social post that he discussed the idea of the U.S. reaching a rare earth minerals deal with Ukraine while hosting French President Emmanuel Macron and speaking to other G7 leaders. Also on Monday, Trump claimed that Putin had no problem with the idea of a European peacekeeping force being deployed to Ukraine as part of a potential peace deal, although Russian officials have rejected the idea of a deployment of soldiers from NATO countries. Trump said, quote, "Yeah, he will accept that. I've asked him that question. Look, if we do this deal, he's not looking for more war. He doesn't mind, but I've specifically asked him that question, and he has no problem with it," end quote. So what we have seen from Russian officials, it depends exactly how, if this Putin really did say he had no problem with this, exactly what Trump proposed it as. Because we've seen Hegseth say that if, troops are deployed to Ukraine, it must be a non-NATO mission, essentially making it sound like it must be a UN peacekeeping deployment. And Hegseth didn't say that explicitly, but Russia has also said that that's the only kind of situation they'll accept is a peacekeeping force under the UN. So, I think that is a realistic option. Maybe that's what they're discussing. I would just be surprised if Russia would go for anything, any kind of European deployment that's under the militaries of those countries. All right, so the next one here, Waltz rules out Ukraine joining NATO. So on Monday, U.S. National Security Advisor Mike Waltz ruled out the idea of Ukraine joining NATO after Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky offered to step down for Ukrainian entry into the military alliance. Waltz said, quote, "I do not see the United States having Ukraine enter into NATO and then having United States troops essentially obligated immediately in terms of Article 5 or coming to have U.S. troops coming directly in for the defense of Ukraine," end quote. So again, this is another thing that's another shift. The Biden administration, would never say that Ukraine could actually join NATO in the near future or anything like that, but they would always leave it open as a possibility, essentially dangling it in front of both Russia and Ukraine, giving Russia a reason to continue the war, to invade Ukraine in the first place, and giving Ukraine a reason to think that they'll get something eventually from the U.S. So Zelensky made these remarks about resigning in exchange for NATO membership in response to Trump calling him a dictator over the lack of elections in Ukraine. Zelensky's comments, they weren't really seen as a genuine offer since NATO membership for Ukraine is simply not on the table because Russia wouldn't accept it. They would continue the war if the option was a deal, at this point, was a deal that would involve Ukrainian NATO membership or continuing the war. And the U.S. has already ruled it out. So, again, it's just really something to see how quickly the U.S., obviously it's a new administration, and the thing is, I'm no big fan of Zelensky, but pinning this whole war on him is not exactly right because the U.S., NATO did convince him and Ukraine to fight this thing, did scuttle the peace talks. Of course, Zelensky has a lot of responsibility for that too, and now it's just the U.S. saying, oh, no, we're going to go over your head, talk to Russia, which I think is the right thing to do. That's how you're going to have to end this war. But just the shift is just it's kind of just incredible how quickly this has all happened. Even though, as I've been saying, this, I think a ceasefire could have been reached already if they moved on this faster. But anyway, just the contrast between Biden and Trump on this is really something. All right, so the next one here, Ukraine war talks framed by Istanbul Protocol agreement. And this is another kind of incredible story. This is from Kyle Anzalone again. So President Donald Trump's Middle East envoy Steve Witkoff explained that talks on ending the Ukraine war are in the Istanbul Protocol agreement framework. That protocol refers to a deal that was nearly signed between Kiev and Moscow that would have ended the war in Ukraine within a few months. So Witkoff said that he believes a deal is very close and could happen in the coming weeks. He said the current talks are following this Istanbul Protocol, and he's referring to the peace talks that happened in March and April 2022 in the very early days of the war. He said, quote, there were very, very what I call cognate and substantive, sorry, I butchered that, negotiations framed in something that's called the Istanbul Protocol Agreement. We came very, very close to signing something, and I think we'll be using that framework as a guidepost to get a peace deal done between Ukraine and Russia, and I think that will be an amazing day, end quote. So, I mean, this goes to show how the back in 2022, there was a serious peace deal on the table. If they're going back to that framework for these negotiations. And the big difference between, we don't know all the details, but the major difference between that deal and this deal is that Russia's not going to withdraw. Under that deal that was on the table, what Russia would have withdrew from the territory it captured, post February 2022 invasion in exchange for Ukrainian neutrality. There was things that needed to be worked out, like security guarantees, and that is a whole big part of this negotiation, is some kind of security guarantees for Ukraine. And the other things that needed to be worked out, I think Russia wanted certain limits on Ukraine's military. But, I mean, just the fact, again, what should be one of the biggest scandals of the Biden administration is the fact that they discouraged this deal from being signed way back in 2022. And you think of all the death that would have been and destruction that would have been avoided if that deal was signed. All right, so the next one here, Iran says Israel's nukes are a grave threat to the world. So on Monday, Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi told the UN's Conference on Disarmament in Geneva that Israel's nuclear weapons pose a grave threat to the world. So Israel is estimated to have somewhere between 90 and 300 nuclear weapons, and its nuclear arsenal gets very little attention since both the US and Israel do not acknowledge its existence. Israel is not a signatory to the Non-Proliferation Treaty, the NPT, meaning that its nuclear weapons program is not subject to inspections by the International Atomic Energy Agency, that's the IAEA, so it is a completely secretive nuclear weapons program, and it's something we don't talk about enough. Think about all the stories about people saying Iran's trying to make a nuclear weapon when there's just no evidence of that. When you have Israel, the only nuclear-armed state in the Middle East that's just been on this war path, invading these countries and occupying Syria and Lebanon and committing genocide and ethnic cleansing. And they got nukes. And I mean, nobody talks about it. People really don't talk about it enough. Even people who are very critical of Israel, just doesn't seem like it's really discussed. And there is, I forget the exact amendment. I should have put it in the story, but there's an amendment to U.S. foreign assistance laws that actually bans military aid to countries, nuclear armed states, that don't sign the non-proliferation treaty. So it's another thing that makes U.S. aid to Israel actually illegal. So Araghchi called for the world to put pressure on Israel over its secret nuclear weapons program. He said, quote, "The international community must hold this regime accountable and demand that it renounce the possession of nuclear weapons, accede to the NPT as a non-nuclear weapon party, and subject all its nuclear facilities and activities to the comprehensive IAEA safeguards," end quote. So he also condemned threats from Israeli officials related to Israel's nuclear weapons. In November 2023, former Israeli Heritage Minister Amichai Eliyahu, who recently resigned over the Gaza ceasefire deal, said that dropping a nuke on Gaza was an option for Israel. And then last year, a member of the Israeli Knesset basically suggested that Israel might use nuclear weapons against Iran, saying that they couldn't destroy Iran's nuclear program through conventional means. And, this is what I mean. You always see Israeli officials saying Iran's making a bomb, they're going to build a bomb. And even the CIA recently acknowledged there's no evidence for that. Trump himself recently said that Iranian leadership doesn't want nuclear weapons. There has been a change, and there's been a conversation in Iran in the face of all this Israeli aggression in the region. There's been a conversation in Iran about the policy, about the prohibition against the development of nuclear weapons, which is an official policy of the Ayatollah. But there's been no sign that the Ayatollah or Iranian leadership has decided to go ahead with making a nuclear weapon. Yet we always hear all these stories about Iran and nukes, and we just never hear about Israel, the state with a secret nuclear weapons program. That I wouldn't put it past them to use a nuclear weapon. All the things that they've done over the past couple of years. I don't think they'd use it on Gaza or the West Bank because it's right, they'd have to deal with the radiation and everything. But, just think about all the horrific things that they've done. All right, so the next one here, the U.S. imposes more sanctions targeting Iranian oil sales. So the U.S. on Monday imposed new sanctions on 30 people and ships over their alleged role in shipping Iranian oil as the Trump administration is attempting to ramp up its so-called maximum pressure campaign against Iran. According to the Treasury Department, among the sanctioned are oil brokers in the UAE and Hong Kong, tanker operators and managers in India and China, the head of Iran's National Iranian Oil Company and the Iranian Oil Terminals Company. The purpose of Trump's orders related to Iran is to drive Iran's exports oil to zero. But the thing is that these oil markets that Iran found in Asia, where they've been able to sell their oil, they're selling to people who aren't afraid, and they're dealing with shippers who aren't afraid of U.S. sanctions. Because the U.S. has been so sanction happy, they've kind of created this alternative market, what they call, what we see people call a shadow fleet. We see this with Russia. The way that they're shipping oil now. And I just don't think that these sanctions are really going to have an impact because you're dealing with people who are not worried about U.S. sanctions. And this is just making diplomacy with Iran less likely, which is not good. And, we see these threats and warnings about Israel preparing to bomb Iran. So this is just not a good sign because Trump, I was a little more positive about Trump and Iran when he first came into office because he was talking so much about how he wanted a deal. Oh, he wants a deal. But then he signs this executive order reimposing the maximum pressure. And he says, oh, I'm sorry to do this. I really don't want to do this. But if you didn't want to do it, then what, it's going back to literally the name of the same policy from his first administration that did not lead to a deal with Iran. He exited the last Iran nuclear deal, did all these sanctions, and nothing came out of that. And he's just repeating the same thing. So just not a good sign. All right, so the next one here, Israel is carrying out raids deeper in Syria. So this one's from Jason Ditz. IDF statements detail that the ongoing invasion of southern Syria is getting broader and broader, with officials saying that they have carried out dozens of raids even deeper into Syria in recent weeks. They did not clarify exactly how deep they've gone, but there have been recent reports of them moving into the Quneitra Governorate and the Dara Governorate in force, putting Israeli troops not far from the Syria-Jordan border. Israel is claiming the region poses a threat to Israeli security, particularly the security of the already occupied Golan Heights, and says most of the raids are about taking arms away from the locals in the area. Signs are that this is more than just about taking guns from Syrians and is giving the appearance of another protracted occupation. Beyond Israel building military bases inside the newly seized territory and saying their presence will continue indefinitely, Syria's Druze minority in Quneitra is reporting that the Israeli forces are offering them entry permits to allow them to go into Israel during the day to work, so as long as they return to Israeli-occupied Syria at night. So they're saying that the Druze could go into Israel, give them work permits, and then they'll go back to occupied Syria. I mean, that sounds like they're planning a permanent occupation if they're offering things like that. And Netanyahu also recently announced that Israel would not allow Syrian forces south of Damascus, and he said that they're going to stay in Syria for an unlimited time. So again, just looking more and more like the Israelis are not going anywhere. All right, so that is it for the news for today. Please go check out our viewpoints, one from Dennis Kucinich and Elizabeth Kucinich. President Trump wants to cut the Pentagon budget in half. How? One from Joseph Terwilliger, the Finnish strategy that could save Ukraine. One from Matthew Petty, did Biden blow the best chance of preventing the war in Ukraine? One from Matt Wolfson, the Gaza trap. And our spotlights from Marcus Stanley, Ukraine war at 3, the victory we demanded, and the attrition we got. So please go check all of that out. And again, check out the Defend the Guard stuff. I'll try to remember to put the link to that story in the description so you could see the phone numbers and everything to call. You could always support this show by liking, subscribing, commenting, sharing it with your friends. Follow us on social media on Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok. I will be back tomorrow with some more news. Thanks for listening.